So today talk about these kinds of trials in mobile health. And I'm really fortunate to be part of a number of collaborations involving smoking cessation, a walking study. It'd be interesting to see what Carolyn says. Also drug abuse and alcoholism. These are a variety of areas in which one can use mobile health. So what I want to do first is I'm going to define this notion of adaptive interventions. I just want to set the stage so that we're all speaking using the same language. And then I'll go into the idea of a just-in-time adaptive intervention. That's more real time. So the idea of adaptive interventions is to utilize the fact that people respond differently to interventions in systematic ways. And to the extent that you can use these systematic ways, you can tailor the intervention or adapt the intervention to the person. And I'm going to show this example. If you've heard me speak before, I often show this, I often discuss this example to throw things off because it is quite close to my heart. It shows really the power of adaptive interventions, not only in health, but also in social settings like welfare, criminal justice, and so on. So this is an intermixing of criminal justice and drug abuse treatment. I was a consultant on this project. So this is a pretty simple adaptive program. It started off where individuals were, when they came into the program, they were classified as either high risk or low risk. High risk is someone who's diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, or they had formal drug abuse treatment. Otherwise, they're considered low risk. And you can see the difference in treatments that they were provided. So the people who were classified as high risk were provided a very expensive judicial treatment, bi-weekly court hearings, extremely expensive. Otherwise, as needed as if low risk. The standard counseling, this is a group-based counseling to help the person with a substance abuse problem. Then beginning monthly and monthly thereafter throughout the drug court program, they're screened, they're assessed for how well they're doing. Now if they're doing well, they just stay wherever they are. There's no change in their treatment. Otherwise, if they're not doing well, there's two options for not doing well. One is non-compliant, the other is non-responsive. So I'll speak to you first about not compliant. So in this setting, not compliant meant that you weren't following the rules of the drug court program. So the drug court program required weekly urine screenings, provided a number of drug abuse counseling sessions. So if you missed 2 or more weekly urine screenings without excuse, or you missed 2 or more drug abuse counseling sessions, you were considered not compliant. In that case, the judicial supervision was stepped up. So this is, if you've heard the step care model, this is very much in line with the step care model. So you see, this is the dotted line in which the judicial supervision is stepped up. Otherwise, you might be deemed non-responsive. Now, this would be an individual who's following all the rules of the drug court program. They're going to counseling, they're providing their urine screens and so on, but they're still struggling with the drug abuse, and in fact they hit the criterion 2 or more positive drug urine screens. So in that case, it's not that they're not compliant in terms of a criminal justice type setting, it's more that they still need more help in terms of their drug abuse problem. And so what happens here is they're stepped up to a more expensive, it's called intensive case management. It involved weekly counseling and a variety of other support services related to the substance abuse. So this is an adaptive intervention. Okay, so there's 5 elements that I want to just discuss to fix our thoughts. First, all of these interventions have some distal outcome that they're trying to target. In this example of the adaptive drug court program, this might be graduation from the successful graduation from the drug court program. They also have a proximal response. So if you look at here, the proximal response is either the person might be monthly, non-responsive, non-compliant, or just be doing okay. That's a proximal response.
So when you say the proximal response, would that be the failure, not failing the drug test, or?
Not, yeah, it depending on the definition.
Okay.
So non-compliance would just be not following.
Right,
the
not
rules.
following, right, okay.
Right, it depends on the setting, but this is some measure of how well you're doing. It's you need to do well on that to achieve the distal outcome. That's the way you want to state it. The tailoring process has these 3 components, the tailoring variables. These are the variables that you're using to decide which treatment for whom. And in our case, we saw if someone was considered high risk, they were treated differently from someone who's considered low risk. So a risk level is a tailoring variable, it's a natural tailoring variable. Decision rules, we saw decision rules here. If you were high risk, you received more intensive judicial supervision. If you were low risk, you received less intensive judicial supervision. That's these if-then rules. These are the decision rules. In the intervention options, we saw a whole variety of intervention options. We saw differing levels of judicial supervision. We saw differing levels of substance abuse treatment. And the adaptation is triggered at decision points. In this case, baseline, high risk, low risk, what should happen to you, and then monthly thereafter. So this is an adaptive intervention. It's not a mobile health adaptive intervention, but it still has these sequential decisions, and we try and adapt them. So how does this differ when you go to real time? Okay, so these are the just-in-time adaptive interventions, and the real difference here is the way in which they're delivered, or the setting in which they're delivered. The idea is that you deliver them when they're needed in the location in which they're needed. So I'll give you 2 examples. They're relatively simplistic compared to what we can begin to really do nowadays. So this was an intervention called Mobile Basics. These were with college students, and the idea of the students were to enter into this study, they had to be binge drinkers and smoking while drinking. They were prompted, all of the information is collected 3 times a day by self-report. And then the intervention is delivered only if the participant reports an urge to smoke. So right away we see that the tailoring variable here is urge to smoke. This is a decision rule right here. And you can imagine what the distal outcome would be here. In this case, it would be reducing the use of alcohol, reducing smoking. Here's another example. This is, I always say this is the example that I need. I think Rich needs it as well. This is where you have software on the computer. It tracks your use of the keyboard as well as the mouse, and it classifies whether or not you're having uninterrupted use of the computer. If you go 30 minutes with uninterrupted use, you then get a message. You get a ping on your phone, and it gives you a message suggesting some sort of activity like standing up, walking around the room, and so on. Again, we see that decision rule here, right? Smartphone delivers message to encourage a walking activity if 30 minutes of uninterrupted computer activity occurs. The tailoring variable is the computer activity. So adaptive interventions and just-in-time adaptive interventions, they're very much the same. They're both time-varying. They're both adaptive to the individual. The difference, another difference is with just-in-time adaptive interventions is the role of technology, the idea or the hope that one can obtain information wherever, whenever it's needed to be obtained, and you can deliver interventions whenever, that is in real time, at 2 a.m. in the stairwell in the middle of the night. So here's the 5 elements, and I just wanted to point out the difference here. The proximal response now is a much more in the moment. I don't want to say momentary, because often people think momentary. Momentary means fleeting. I don't mean fleeting. It's just intended. The interventions here are intended to have an impact on your near-time behavior. And the decision points are more real-time decision points. And I'll give you a specific example. We're working on a number of these, and I can speak more about that as the talk proceeds. So I'm going to go through each of those parts. Remember the distal outcomes, the proximal responses, the decision rules, and so on and so forth. And the reason why I do this, and I actually find this whole paradigm really attractive if you're interested in behavioral science. And the reason why is there's this incredibly close connection between the statistics, the experimentation, and behavioral theory. And I find that really nice. It's quite pleasurable, this idea that we might be able to inform behavioral theory more directly than we had in the past, yet it informs how we collect data and how we design an intervention in a very direct, dynamic way. I find that really interesting. So I'm going to go through these and point out this. You'll see some similarities to the way behavioral interventions have always been designed. So the distal outcome in substance abuse, it's almost always substance abuse cessation, smoking cessation, and so on. It could be in activity studies, maintain an increased activity level. Also, you see a good bit of this interest in adherence to either self-care behaviors, say by adolescent individuals who have diabetes, adherence to take-home meds, take-home chemotherapy for individuals who have cancer. So there's a whole variety of areas. These would all be the longer-term distal outcome. And the way one tries to target that distal outcome is you formulate these interventions to focus on a proximal response that will then lead to the distal outcome you care about. So it's strongly consistent the way we think in terms of causal structure. So what are these proximal responses? We can think of them as mediators. They're critical to the intervention achieving the longer-term outcome, this dynamic intervention. So short-term targeted behavior, substance use over the next hour, over the next 30 minutes, physical activity, adherence, and so on. So the example I'll show you will be physical activity over the next hour. But we have one study that we're working on that the proximal response is stress over the next couple of minutes. So it just depends on the setting. Another thing that's really interesting in this domain, and it's becoming more and more clear to people who work in this area, is the really important role of engagement interventions. And so here too, a proximal response can be some measure of engagement or some measure of burden. And we have that in this intervention as well. Intervention options. It turns out, as a statistician, I didn't really have a very nuanced view of what you could provide via a mobile, what you could possibly deliver via a mobile device. But it turns out the variety of interventions is much wider than I had ever thought. Behavioral strategies, for example, if someone is experiencing a lot of craving or stress, you might suggest something they can do to take their mind off. It's like going for a walk. So it's more of a behavioral strategy. Cognitive strategies, if someone slips up and smokes a cigarette, how do they reframe that event so that they can continue on? Motivational strategies, as you can imagine, this is a big, important strategy in this area. Whether to provide self-report information, how you provide that information, so it's most motivating to a person. I should mention, these are all pushes. We're talking about pushes. There's always pulls in all the interventions I'm involved with, but I'm focusing mainly on pushes.
What do you mean by pushes?
So pushes are interventions we deliver. We interrupt your life to deliver it. Pulls are, there's a variety of supportive services on the phone, and you decide when you want them. You pull them. Everything I work on always has that variety of pulls. It's the pushes that I'm interested in. They have the greatest potential to be helpful and also the greatest potential to aggravate you. So this is why this particular option of doing nothing is a really good option. So what are tailoring variables? They're moderators, right? The way we think, they're moderators. They tell us which intervention option is best, which might work yet not produce as much aggravation or burden on the part of the participant. I've listed some examples here. We'll see the study I'll talk about shortly. One of the moderators we were really interested in was how busy their calendar looked over the next few hours, because that might impact whether they can respond to the intervention. Decision points. So what are the decision points in this? So we saw in the adaptive drug court programs every month. But here, it could be every so many minutes. For example, in this a smoking cessation study targeting stress, the proximal response to stress, it may be every single minute. There's the potential to try and intervene. That doesn't mean you'll intervene. Most of the time you choose the do nothing option, but you could intervene at any given minute. Another type of decision point, which is pretty common in this domain, is when there's a button you can press on the phone and request help. This is particularly common in substance abuse. And a big question when you're trying to design these just-in-time adaptive interventions is how often should the decision points be? And this is usually determined by the dynamics of the variables you're trying to tailor on. So if you think stress can change very rapidly over time, you would choose closer points in time. And I'll show you an example of activity shortly. And the decision rules, what do? They are implemented at each decision point. Of course, most of the time they're going to say do nothing. But they could then suggest that you ping the person and suggest that they try a strategy, a behavioral strategy. Usually these just-in-time adaptive interventions, they have a whole variety of different decision rules, only some of which you might investigate in an experiment. Okay, so I just wanted to go through it before we get to the experimental setting. So we have the distal outcome, the proximal response, which is guided by these mediational theories, so more real-time dynamic mediational theories. Of course, you might tell me, and many people would say, oh, there's very few really dynamic, real-time mediational theories that we can appeal to. We're going to talk about an experiment that one can use to help to test those theories, help develop those theories. And it turns out neuroscience, they have a lot of ideas about these types of theories. So when we see the intervention options, the tailoring variables, these are variables measured in real time, and so on. So I want to describe to you hard steps. This is a study this was the last week of recruitment for this study. It's taking place in Ann Arbor. So this is a physical activity study. Each individual has a jawbone. It's a move up little device that's on your wrist. It collects both step count as well as a crude measure of sleep quality. And then there's a mobile app that goes on your smartphone called Heart Steps. This is the first of 3 studies. The next 2 studies this one is only for sedentary adults who have a full-time job. The next 2 are for individuals who had a heart attack. They went through the intensive outpatient program, and now they're transitioning out, and we're going to try and help them maintain their activity level. Usually people in this setting very rapidly decrease their activity back to pre-heart attack level. So it's a 42-day study. The distal outcome in this case is quite straightforward. It's just their activity level over 42 days. It's a pilot study. And the response, though, is going to be step count over the next hour. We haven't gotten to the decision times yet. The intervention options at each decision time will be whether or not to provide some sort of activity recommendation. These activity recommendations are tailored. They're tailored to whether you're at home, at work, the time of the day, and the kind of weather outside. If it's bad, good, so on. So whether or not to provide this, and whether or not to provide activity planning in the evening, so where you would plan the next day. In both cases, I'm focusing on yes, no, and the reason for that is I'm quite concerned about these pushes and the fact that they may be burdensome because they do interrupt the person. So I think that's where we're going to get a lot of the signal in the data. The actual tailoring of that recommendation is done using expert judgment. Decision time. So in this case, for the activity suggestions, it's every 2 to 2.5 hours. So you might ask, how do you get that? So originally we thought we would have many more decision points, but then we obtained access to jawbone data for large numbers of users. And among individuals who are relatively sedentary, it turned out if they were active, they tended to be active around 5 times a day. These are people with jobs. So in the morning before work, around noon, in the afternoon, right after work, and in the evening. And that's where this timing comes from. So it comes directly from looking at that data. So that's decision times. These are the times at which we might provide an activity suggestion, recommendation. Every evening, there's the planning activity. You might get a planning activity or not. And that's at a user-specified time. Tailoring variables. How might we tailor whether or not we provide a suggestion to you? You see a variety of tailoring variables. As I mentioned earlier, busyness of the calendar was one that we thought might be interesting. So if your calendar is looking really busy over the next 2 hours, you're thinking you're much less likely to act on that suggestion versus. So I wanted to show you an example of what this lock screen recommendation would look like. This is one I got on a weekend. It was in the afternoon, and it was last March, so it was quite cold. It was only 11 degrees. It was a beautiful day, actually. And so this, on my notifications, I got this little thing. This is on a Saturday, so you wouldn't have got this at work, for example. So what could you make to your soup? You can do squats or jumping jacks while water heats up. And then I can make this notification go away. And the way I can make the notification go away is I can press thumbs down. I didn't like it. I can press thumbs up. It'll go away if I press thumbs up. I thought it was okay. Or I can press this button, and then a drop-down menu comes up, and you can turn off the intervention for 4, 6, or 8 hours. In fact, you could always turn off this intervention at any given time. So when I was trialing it, I would turn it off if I had a lot of meetings. And the reason why I did that was the way this recommendation would appear is the phone would ping, it would light up to attract my attention. And I wouldn't want that to happen in a meeting. So, oops, I went the wrong way. So I'm going to talk to you about the micro-randomized trial. Quite a lot of interesting things come up when you're thinking about pushes in the context of a mobile intervention. And we're going to talk about that here. So these are trials in which each person is randomized at every decision point. So in the case of heart steps, it was 42 days, 5 times a day, so it's 210. So it's 200, in the case of heart steps, every person is randomized 210 times. And at each of those times, we have a variety of sensor data from the phone, how they're using the phone. We have data from the band, and so on, and self-report data as well. In the smoking cessation study, I haven't described it here, but that one, the decision time is every minute for 10 hours a day for 10 days. So it's approximately 6,000 times. So you can imagine it's many, many times to be randomized. Of course, as you can also imagine, the randomization probability is quite small. So at the end of a trial, what do? You record the outcomes that you're seeing, the observations. These are all the sensor streams, as well as the self-report, and so on. You have your distal goal. You record that. You record your proximal response. In the case of heart steps, it's activity following one of those 5 times. You record potential tailoring variables, so we know how busy the person's calendar is on their phone, and the weather at the time a suggestion is provided, and so on. So it's a good bit of data, as you can well imagine. And then we record these, and then we randomize between the intervention options. In this simple case, it was yes, provide something, no, do not. So it was just binary. And then at the end of the trial, we use the data to assess in what context are these messages most useful. And we can construct decision rules. Now, I just want to, some people, I guess some of you, this trial is envisioned to be the first, this micro-randomized trial is the first it's the first trial after you give, these decision rules, we call them warm start decision rules, because then in our last trial we'll take them and each decision rule, then we're working on algorithms that will personalize the decision rule to the person as they use the device in the last study. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So Pam and I, Pam, you're a sedentary adult. So have I, you've had a heart attack? So have I. Now, at the beginning, Pam and I, we might have the exact same value of our tailoring variable. So you would think we would get the same sort of intervention, or at least with the same probability we'd get the same intervention, right? But as time goes on, Pam will respond differently, may respond differently to the intervention in certain settings than I respond. So the algorithms detect how she responds differently from me and slowly but surely move her decision rules towards her as compared to the ones for me. This is actually what's done in web advertising. So, but we're not going to talk about that today. I just wanted to let you know. Right now, our goal is to get the warm start. And why do we want a warm start here? We want a warm start because if I give you the warm start decision rules, I've gotten way off track, but I can't help it. If I give you the warm start decision rules, you, the scientist, can vet those rules. You can tell me, you'll be able to give me, if a rule doesn't make sense, you'll be able to tell me it doesn't make sense. You'll be able to tell me, oh, I have a new sensor that we can measure, and I think that should be, its output should be in the decision rules. You can really provide a lot of input by the science. Yet they were formed by data, so it's a melding of data with the science, and I really find that attractive. Also, as in that third study, as we track people, we'll be tracking each one of us, and if the decision rules for Pam start to behave in certain, what we'll call error-prone ways, we can do a reset and reset hers back to the warm start. So it will provide this stability and robustness that I need desperately in a health setting.
Yeah, and I was going to ask that sort of trade-off between models that borrow strength from others versus at what point do you start to go completely with what you're learning about that individual,
right? And
when you can backtrack and say, I've gone down.
I'm in la la land. Yeah. That's exactly the way we're thinking. So this is borrowing strength between people. That's what this study is about. Yeah.
What again is your definition of a warm start?
A warm start is a decision rule that we form by pooling information from everyone in the study, the micro-randomized study.
But then you're trying to get optimal decision rules for.
Well, it's optimal up to the tailoring variables that we use, right? But it could be that Pam and I may appear at the same level of stress, but for some reason she can handle stress a little bit better and can tolerate being pinged more than me.
Yeah.
And that can only be discovered in a more real-time setting.
Yeah.
I just wanted to talk to you about why micro-randomization, because this comes up a lot. I give talks often to computer science groups, and the natural question is, they say, well, look, I can get access to hundreds of thousands of participants from Jawbone or some other company, and I can look and see when they access the interventions that are on the phone or when they utilize the interventions, and then I can start to do these same kind of data analyses. And the point here is this randomization is going to allow us to disentangle why someone accesses an intervention or follows an intervention from the effect of that intervention. So it's the classical role of randomization is being played here. And another question, this also I put in often in CS talks, because this is another thing that's, I think it's really important for all of us to think about. It's very easy to get enthralled with all this mobile health stuff and the idea of doing cool machine learning and cool whatever. But then the thing is though, if you want to get funding to write a grant to develop a mobile health intervention, you have to be able to justify the trial costs in a way which is clearly communicated to a broader audience and gives them guarantees of a certain product. And so here it's, how do you justify it? You address a question that can be stated clearly, and you design the trial so that you can answer further questions. So the trial can't be designed so that you can only answer one question. It costs way too much money, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to ask the most simplest question of all. We design these suggestions to impact your behavior in the near time. That's how we designed it. Is it doing that? Are these suggestions impacting your behavior in the near time? This is if you're familiar with analysis of variance and factorial designs, this is a factorial design, and we're looking at main effects. That's what we're looking at. And that's the classical way you determine the sample size for factorial designs. 42-day trial, we already said that. We're going to look to see whether or not we should provide an activity recommendation. We'll code that 0, no, 1, yes. And here's the randomization. Okay, this is another interesting point here. The randomization probabilities, as you can imagine, when I was thinking about this, I really wanted it to be 1/2, because we all know that if you randomize with 1/2, you get the highest power. But in mobile health, it's often going to be drastically different from 1/2. It's because of the issue of burden. You don't want to provide too many, you don't want to interrupt someone too many times each day. In this case, we wanted on an average of 2 suggestions per day, 5 decision points, so we used 0.4 to get an average of 2. So here's another, an interesting aspect. I'm going to show you several interesting aspects about these mobile health trials. First of all, there's this whole issue of habituation. So if I'm given a message, even if it's tailored to the time of the day, I still will habituate at some rate. In other words, I'll start to ignore it. So we have to be concerned that the effect of the suggestion on your activity in the near time may vary over time because of the habituation, and also because of the interruption and the burden being imposed. So when we talk about main effects here, we don't talk about a cross-sectional main effect as in classical factorial studies. We talk about a time-varying main effect, and you can very well expect that it's going to dissipate, or potentially it might dissipate. And this issue, I think, is a really interesting issue, and it's an issue that I honestly tried to avoid. I didn't want it to play a role. It just seemed to be too complicated, and I began to realize that it dominates mobile health, and it's something we have to confront if we're going to work in that field. And that's this issue of availability. You can only provide treatments or interventions if a person is available. You can only do that. So in Heart Steps, we have a classifier that's running on the phone, and the classifier classifies the person as either, it takes about 1.5 minutes, it classifies the person as either moving too fast, so that they might be in a car, if you're classified, or walking or sedentary. If you're classified as potentially being in a car, we consider you unavailable. And you can imagine the reason for this. I mean, we don't want to interrupt someone who's driving, right? And so you're unavailable if you could be driving a car. Of course, in future, one should be a little bit more precise about that, because you're just going fast, right, in this classifier. Another way you're unavailable in the Heart Steps application is if the classifier says you're walking right now. We don't want to ping you and suggest you go for a walk. That would also not be a good idea, but that's from a scientific perspective as opposed to an ethical perspective. And then lastly, a person in Heart Steps is not available because they can turn off the intervention. They have control, right? They can turn it off at any given time. They know they're going to have a whole day of review meetings. They turn it off in the morning, it's over. So they're unavailable. So in some sense, they've removed themselves from being provided an intervention. So when we say main effect, what do we mean? We're talking about the main effect at a particular time among available individuals, because that's our population on which we're interested in. So it's the effect of a treatment or an intervention option at a decision time. It's the difference in proximal response between available individuals assigned an activity recommendation and available individuals who are not assigned an activity recommendation. This is a causal effect. It's a causal effect among the subpopulation. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So we're using AT, that's our notation for whether or not you're delivered an intervention and activity suggestion. IT is whether or not you're available, 1 if you're available at the time, 0 otherwise. So what is the definition of the main effect? It's the contrast, and you can write this, for causal inference, you can write this comes out of potential outcomes. But this is the contrast between your activity following a decision point, if you're available, among those who are available and got a message, versus your activity among those available who did not get a message. Now, I just drew a little schematic of what it might look like. It's very crude because, as we all know, your responsivity may vary by the time of the day, whether it's weekend or weekday. So this is averaged out over the 210 decision times. And I just wanted to talk about this. Why might we expect this difference as time changes to first increase and then potentially decrease? First of all, people come into the study. Now, people have argued with me. They said, oh, well, it should start off above 0 right here. Maybe it should. But I'll just think that you're confused. You don't know how to take advantage of these suggestions, so you start off with no effect. Then you start to try out the suggestions. When you get them, you try them out. You move a little bit more. Unfortunately, you begin to habituate, and they become less and less effective as time goes on. That's one reason why you might expect to see a curving linear form. Another reason, however, is the fact that the subpopulation among whom you're assessing the effect of the intervention is changing with time. So here, pretty much everyone who's not driving, I'll just ignore the driving, pretty much everyone is available early on, right? Then what's going to happen is there'll be some people who, they drink the Kool-Aid, they start moving, right? They're generally moving because they're being trained to move. They're moving at these 5 times. They're not available anymore. So they're not in this group anymore. So the people who are still available might not be as responsive, right? Then you also have the group of people who are aggravated, who are turning off the intervention. They're not available either. So you only have the people who are still around. They haven't learned to be active at each of those 5 times. They're the ones that are still around for you to assess the intervention of efficacy as time goes on. It's a very interesting realization. And this availability comes up everywhere across mobile health. Actually, often people think they don't have availability. In fact, they do. I want to talk to you about how we determine the sample size. I think this is interesting, particularly if you have a background in the behavioral field. Of course, as we said, we want to determine whether there's any signal at all, right? Any signal at all. So our null is there's nothing going on here. It's just 0, flat line. And then, so how do you devise a test? Well, our capital T is 210 in heart steps, right? So we actually have 210 effects that we could be looking at, 1 for every single time point in the study. And there's this long history of statistics of how to deal with these kinds of settings, because no one in their right mind is going to waste 210 degrees of freedom. That's just not how you play this game. And what happens is we make bets. And so if you're used to machine learning, they make bets on sparsity and parsimony. We, in the behavioral sciences, we often make bets on smoothness. We use linear models to model outcomes and so on. These are bets. And a bet that's often made in testing is you say, well, I'm going to construct a test statistic which has good power against certain types of alternatives. So any kind of alternative that's near the type of alternative that I'm focusing on, I'll be able to detect with decent power. So it's a trade-off of bias and variance. You don't pretend that the true functional form is that form. Again, it's a trade-off. So here what we're going to do with hard steps, I think it makes a lot of sense to go with the quadratic. Why? Because I'm very worried about habituation, to be honest. Indeed, if at the end of the study, and the smoking cessation study, and we'll have another study, if we're not going to be seeing down terms, I'm probably going to go to a linear here, because I don't want to waste degrees of freedom. So here I'm using 3 degrees of freedom instead of 210, and I'll only test 3 terms if they're equal to 0. I'm not assuming that the treatment effect has a quadratic form, right? That's not what's going on here. So the test statistic, I'm not going to write it down. It's very simple. It's just a generalization of linear regression. It's quite interesting. There's some really interesting things in this domain if you're a quantitative kind of person. Turns out random effects models mess up all the causal inference. It's very disturbing. You can't do random effects in this setting, at least not at this time. I don't see how you can do it. The test statistics, it's quadratic in the estimators of these terms. And what we need from the scientists is you give us a certain false positive rate. That's the type 1 error rate. You give me a power. These are the usual things we're all used to. And then you give me a detectable signal to noise. That's a standardized effect size. And then you also have to, I'll show you what else you give me. Oh, yeah, I got to tell you something before I show you the sample sizes. Okay, you'll give me some other stuff, but I'm getting off track here. But this happened, okay, so here's the last really cool thing, I think, here. Really cool thing that I found about this topic was when I first saw the sample size calculation. So I had a grad student working on this, and he comes to me with the sample size calculations and I tell him he's wrong. He's completely screwed up everything. He's done it all wrong. And it's because I didn't have this intuition. And I think if I were a more applied statistician, I would have realized that this would happen, but I didn't. But it's very interesting because the micro-randomized trial is a natural generalization of the N of 1 study of a single case design. It's just from a statistical point of view, and it tests different kinds of estimates as opposed to a single case study. So we're going to assess the effect of an activity recommendation, and we're going to, because we're targeting the power of our test against smooth alternatives, we're going to use not only between subject contrast, that is a subject who got a recommendation versus a subject who didn't, contrast them in activity level. We're going to also use within subject contrasts, and that's because we're targeting a smooth alternative. That's what it buys for us. The required number of subjects will be small. So again, we're going to go back to what you would give me. You would give me your proximal effect on the first day. I always tell everybody to tell me 0 because I'm conservative, because I'm a statistician, right? And this will make the sample size bigger. I'll give you a variety of these on the next slide. Average proximal effects. This is like an average standardized effect. Oh, and Carolyn, when I was doing this, I actually used some of your standardized effect sizes to guide this, just as you might want to know. But and then you have to tell me what day you think there'll be a maximal effect. At what time do you think everything's going to start going down the tubes? Hard steps, no initial effect. That's my conservatism right there. I'll show you a table of this, and it's a 42-day study. We thought, well, okay, somewhere around halfway through or so, things are going to start to degenerate. So here's the effect sizes. So the power's 0.8, type 1 error is 0.05. Where you have to think about the availability. This is 70% of the time someone's available to be intervened on, or 50%. These are the standardized effect sizes and the sample sizes. So the first thing one does, you probably are having the same reaction I did when that student came and showed it to me. This can't be true. Because in our world, these standardized effect sizes look incredibly small, because 0.2 is really small for us. And look at the sample sizes. But first of all, it's partially because we're doing within-person contrast as well as between-person contrast. The other thing that's really important is to realize that we don't yet have a good handle on what constitutes a small, medium, and large effect size in these dynamic settings, the effect of a suggestion on you in the next time, it's over the next hour. We just don't have that good. So it could be that 0.1 is a massive effect size. We just don't know that. But we will, I mean, because there's a number of these trials now going on, so we will soon. Heart steps is we used a sample size of 40. These are a couple of final slides. If you're looking to design one of these studies, you have to really, you don't want to overguess the availability. If you think that people are going to be available 70% of the time, but in reality they're only available 50% of the time, then you're going to really underpower the study. I mean, this makes perfect sense. This is like what you would expect. You also don't want to overestimate the size of the standardized effect, the average standardized effect. That's, again, exactly the way what you would expect in these studies. It turns out the power, even if you have interaction terms or moderation, this is classic factorial design, actually. That it preserves a lot of the power to detect the main effects. These are marginal effects, and the interactions have to be grotesque before you kill the main effects. And that's pretty well known in the factorial design literature. One of the nice things is now secondary data analysis can look at moderation by how busy your calendar is, your stress level, and so on. And they can help you form your decision rules for that warm start. And that's exactly what's going to happen in our study. I just wanted to go through, this is my second to last slide, when are they not and when are they useful? Because we've had a lot of discussions with people. It took us a while to be able to explain this. So you would not want to use one of these trials when the malleable circumstances are rare. So you're interested in knowing what kind of alert to send clinical staff when someone is thinking about suicide. That's just too rare. It's just too rare. Like, or if you're studying bipolar disorder and you're interested in early signs of entry into a manic phase. People don't enter manic phases all the time. Again, it's too rare for this type of study design. It's useful when malleable circumstances change rapidly, like stress. If stress is, in smoking, stress is one of the big factors leading to relapse, and that's a circumstance that can change during the day. Adherence to medications, self-care behaviors if you're a diabetic. There's many behaviors one has to do throughout the day. Physical activity. Another case that it's not useful is when you can't measure the proximal response in a feasible manner. So in heart steps, the proximal response was activity. That's not a problem. It's just being measured by the little band. But if your proximal response, for example, is craving, and you have no good way besides asking the person what their craving is, this is really difficult. I mean, for any kind of imagining to roll this out in real life, you'd have to have some more sensor-based measure of craving. Now, you saw us, we had the thumbs down, thumbs up, and this is thought to be a little bit less obtrusive, a less obtrusive way of measuring treatment burden, because they can just do thumbs down to swipe it away. So that's a big issue here, is if you might want to have a variety of ways to measure treatment burden that are that are sort of easy, that the person kind of would do no matter what, because in their interactions with the phone, clearing off notifications, the way they clear it off. Here I put up pictures of lots of collaborators. I just wanted to point out, these types of studies require really interdisciplinary teams. I mean, I have computer scientists. This guy's PI of one of the big data grants that I'm part of with mobile sensors. We have undergraduates. You can recognize Pedja here. He's a human-computer interaction. A behavioral scientist, another behavioral scientist, statisticians. These guys right here developed the app. Here's a computer scientist. So everybody coming together to build these interventions, run the trial, and then analyze the data. Thank you.
Question. I want to see if this is the right intuition, and then if so, this intuition leads to kind of a subtle direction to go. Suppose the idea is that you have a particular gradient that you want to take the subject down because you have that the distal outcome you
right.
get them to.
Yeah.
And you have these list of nudges, and
right.
you're trying out which nudge works best for that person.
Right.
So
in which context?
Yeah, in which context and so on. So then you get to your kind of main effect may habituate. But the question is it that the effectiveness of that nudge has sort of changed over time? Or can you also distinguish whether the surface of the individual has changed and now there's a new gradient because there's a different way to get to that distal
yeah, right. Now they should be
changed.
Yeah.
Can you make that distinction between whether the nudges have stopped working and work differently versus you've changed the gradient?
I think you would, well, maybe I'm misinterpreting you, but I think you would have to look at the kind of nudge, like you might have higher goals if they're doing well, so the kind of nudge may change. But when you were talking about gradient, well, these are marginal effects. So I hesitate to have too much scientific content beyond detecting a signal, right? Because they are quite marginal. They're marginal in time, except the time.
Okay, so you don't like this idea of going down the gradient may have changed.
Well,
right?
the gradient will, like it could be rapidly decreasing as they habituate more and more.
Right.
And that might actually be a trigger for a different kind of intervention to come in.
Yeah, different set of nudges.
Oh, I'm totally with you. Oh, now
yes.
I get it. Yeah. Okay, so like one of the things we're looking at is how the slope, say like your proximal, your intervention is focusing on stress. So how could the slope of prior stress tell you what to do next? And that's a gradient. Because that's a gradient there. But another thing too is we're thinking that maybe the volatility in stress over a recent period of time might be important in telling you what to do next.
Different sets of nudges now become
relevant.
Okay,
Right. We've kept it actually, I think the way you're speaking, it's more, you're looking at different kinds of interventions, whereas here we've always gone on and off. So we don't go from a very crude level. In fact, in Heart Steps, there's two types of messages. One that are targeted more at reducing sedentary behavior, like for example, you might get a message that suggests you stand up and roll your arms. That's not an activity message. And then other messages are actually activity messages. And it could be that one might believe that sedentary messages or anti-sedentary messages are good at some phase, whereas activity messages are better at another phase. But we haven't, right now I'm going for the low-hanging fruit, and because of the burden associated with pushing, I think but I'm totally with you, that the type of message, say anti-sedentary versus activity, might change as you move through. Kind of, not quite stages of change, but yeah.
Question for you on your original model. I was thinking of gamification. Is that?
Oh, yeah. So one of the things we're very interested in is engagement strategies, right? And so I'm thinking for gamification, I'm thinking engagement. Now there may be gamification in terms of treatment, but engagement here and reducing boredom and reducing the rate at which you habituate is a big deal here. And so one of the things we're actually working on an app, it's a competition that NIDA has for substance abuse. It's due in April. There's a group of us working on it. And one of our big interventions are going to be of that type. How do we stimulate the person and keep them engaged by making it a game? And all we're trying to do is collect data in the setting. I actually think thinking about this from the point of view of survey data, by survey data I mean mobile survey, sensor data, I think here, the just-in-time adaptive intervention is an engagement intervention. How do we keep people engaged so they continue to allow us to get real-time data on it? And then the gamification is really important. I'm on board. I mean, I don't know how to do it. I mean, a lot of people are doing it in this space, and I don't know what we're going to end up doing, but I'm with you.
Well, thank you very much.